If the meta crisis is a failed story, a story of alienation from the larger whole, then it's a new story, a story of being omni-considered to the larger whole that resolves the meta crisis, and an essential part of that new story, which we call Homo Amor. Homo sapien becomes Homo Amor, the new human and the new humanity. An essential part of that new story is a new story of relationship. What's that new story of relationship? The movement from Wholemate to soulmate to Wholemate, to evolutionary relations, to Homo Amor relationships. And we're just so deep in the work of this revolution. And if you've never been here before, I want to just take 1 second to share with you, what we're doing, and then to dive in, to set our intention. We have this realization of what we call, friends, the second shock of existence. The second shock of existence. The first shock of existence, the realization of death at the dawn of civilization. Human beings realize, I'm going to die. And death presses us into life. Can everyone feel that? Right? Step inside, right? Like step inside, so beautiful, right? Death presses us into life. That's the first shock of existence. And then we go through all of the stages of human history. And we've now arrived at the second shock of existence, which is the realization that after all the dignities of modernity and all the disasters of modernity, something new is on the table. After all the beauty and all the breakthrough, but also all the breakdown and all the ugliness, right? Something new is on the table. We're at this moment in which we realize that all civilizations have ultimately failed. But when a civilization failed and it was local, life went on. Now we have a global civilization with exponential technologies, which means that we're now at a moment where we're confronting, quite literally, if you read the information carefully, we're quite literally confronting the second shock of existence, which is not the death of the human being, but the potential death of humanity. And in one of the upcoming works that we're working on kind of the 4 dimensions of the meta crisis and what it means, but we call that the meta crisis, or the second shock of existence. Now, what we're saying here is, and that's what we're going to talk about today, and this whole new way, we're going to talk about relationship today, and we're going to talk about Barbara Marx Hubbard, and we're going to talk about Wholemates, and we're going to talk about the future of relationships. But I want to place this in context, and it's this wildly important context. What we're understanding is that the only way to change the vector of history is to tell a new story. To tell a new story of value, but not just to make up the story, not a conjecture, not a contrived story, but to actually be radically committed to gather together the best strands of information and to be covered with paint as we paint this new story into history. And this new story is drawn from all of the deepest colors and the validated insights of all the great strands of traditional ancient wisdom in the pre-modern world, all of the most profound insights of modernity and its sciences and psychologies and new ways of information gathering and re-understandings of human identity and the divine. And we're also merging together the best of postmodern insight, which itself, although it has many great flaws, but also has many great contributions. So we're weaving together the validated insights of pre-modern, traditional, modern, and postmodern, all wisdom streams, integrated together in a seamless weave, which is a new story of value that we can share deep into China and deep into Russia, right, and deep into Asia, and deep into New Zealand, and deep into the Americas, North and South, right, and deep into Europe, and deep into the Middle East, right? In other words, we're weaving that together to generate a shared story of value. Now stay close with me for a second, okay? And this is what Christina was pointing towards in the recapitulation. It's what we talked about last week. Story is the ontology of reality. Okay, story's real. Story's not a contrivance. It's not even a human contrivance. Does everyone get that? It's not something human beings made up, right? We made up story. Story is actually real. It's the structure of the real. And either next week or the week after, we're going to start a series on story. And we'll, of course, allude to and recapitulate lots of things we've talked about. But just for now, for a second, right? Story is the structure of the real. And that story exists and lives all the way down and all the way up the evolutionary chain. Now, for those of you who might be new, I'm going to just add something. If you're kind of completely new, you're kind of thinking to yourself, just give me the inspiration already. That's not exactly what we're doing here. What we're here to do is to actually do the most revolutionary act that's possible at this moment in history. And Darwin did it in a particular way and got lots of it wrong and some of it right. Freud did it in a particular way, got lots of it wrong, but some of it right. Marx did it in a particular way, got lots wrong and some right. Einstein did it, got a whole bunch of things wrong, but some really important things right. But those are people who told a new story in the sciences and the social sciences, economics, in order to change history. We need to weave together, right? Each one of those four was in a certain sense blinded, right, to entire domains of information and meaning and value. We need to weave the strands of value, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, weave them together into a new story of value. And it's only such a new story of value that becomes a global story, a shared story, which is a context for our diversity that allows us to live together, but not just to live together, to act together, to create global coordination in response to global challenges. COVID, no global coordination. Oh my God, you've got this virus violating every national boundary, but the nations of the world can't get together to respond or to gather information or to create a shared wisdom response, right? The entire world polarized in every country over COVID. And literally millions of people died who didn't need to die. And that's quite literal. And I mean that very precisely. And I've spent an enormous amount of time looking carefully at the COVID thing. So I'm not talking off the cuff. Millions of people died who didn't need to die because we could not establish information gathering, right? A global coordination response to a global challenge. That's shocking, right? So there's no global coordination in response to global challenge because there's no global resonance. We don't resonate with each other. And therefore, there can't be any global coherence, right? Because ultimately, there's no global intimacy because there's no shared story. And intimacy is based on a shared story, but a real story, a shared story of value. So story is the structure of reality. And story goes all the way down, right? Story at the level of matter. There's a story. Story means that there's a sequence of events that are intrinsically related to each other. They're not random. Number one, that's the first element of story. Two, story follows a plot line. There's a plot line in the story. Three, that plot line follows the intrinsic desires, right, that are inherent, right, in that plot line, right? Four, right, those desires are desires for value, right? So there's a desire for value, right? Number four, and that desire for value, right, is somehow there's some dimension of freedom in pursuing those values, right? It's elemental proto-freedom, but there's some expression of aliveness and freedom that actually lives all the way down, even at the subatomic level. As Richard Feynman, the physicist, pointed out, right? There's a kind of proto-free will, as it were, a proto-freedom, even at the level of matter. And Stuart Kauffman did, right, very, very good mathematics on this. There's a proto-freedom because a story means it's not a tech manual, it's a story, right? So story is a structure of reality. There's a story that lives at the world of matter, and then story evolves at the world of life, and then also the different levels of the biosphere, and then into the human realm. And then at every level of the human realm, story evolves until we realize that actually, we're actually actors in the story. A. B, we can see the whole story. We can actually, for the first time, see, right, the first Big Bang, the world of matter, the second Big Bang, the world of life, the third Big Bang, the birth of culture. We actually see the story. We realize that the whole story lives in us. We realize that the story is evolving. We realize that we're actors in the story. We realize that we're storytellers in the story. And we realize that we're the authors of the next chapters in the story. That's called conscious evolution. That's called the universal love story. But the universal love story in which we realize that our story is chapter and verse in the universal love story. So story is everything. Story is not tangential. Right? The masters summarized this in 3 words when they said, God loves stories. It was an elliptical way of saying everything that we just said. Now stay with me. I want to get this. This is really beautiful. I want to add something to this, and it's crazy beautiful, okay? Right? I mean, it's gorgeous, right? It's gorgeous. So there's always more than one story that you can tell. Let me see if I can find this for you. Hold on. I have a present for you. This is my bedtime reading these days. It's by my bed. I recommend it to everyone. He's a great geneticist at the University of Chicago. And he points out, right, take a look at page 81. Okay, 81. Right, he points out that he's talking about, it's called DNA as poetry. But of course, he's, a very heavy scientist. And he points out that you can have multiple messages in a single sequence of DNA, right? Multiple messages, right, in a single sequence of DNA. And I'm not going to go through there's an enormous amount of footnotes, and this has been my kind of late night. But what multiple messages in a single sequence of DNA means is that you don't only have one story. DNA is telling a story, but actually within one sequence of DNA, there's multiple messages, and those messages can be activated, right, by the receiver. It's the receiver who decides, as it were, which message to activate. So actually, there's not only one story of reality you can tell. You can cogently build a number of stories of reality, but there's one story that actually organizes the information in the most adequate, in the most elegant way. But there are other possible stories that you could cogently tell. In other words, I'm going to get really fancy now for a second. Everyone up for fancy for just a second? Is this too much? Is this too much, everybody? And we're going to do a little fancy footwork for a second, okay? Here we go, a little fancy footwork. There's a pluralism of stories. It means there's more than one possible story. Stories are not all equal. Some stories are better than others because they account for much more empirical information, right? So if you dismiss entire realms of interior information in telling your story, then it's not going to work, right? So just give you one example. So give you an example. So I talk every other week to a great man whose name I won't mention now. He's one of my favorite people in the entire world. And if you think you know who it is, don't write it in the chat box. Okay, do not write it. He's an incredibly brilliant scientist and mathematician and just really, really important thinker. And we're working on some key projects together. And at some point, we always come to the issue of the continuity of consciousness, meaning death and what happens after death. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what happens after death, but what we do know based on an enormous amount of empirical information is that the most plausible understanding and explanation of all the empirical information we have is that death is not the end of the story, that there's an absolute continuity of consciousness. Now, every time I get with my friend to this set of information, you with me? So I then share with him and I say, okay, go take a look at this book, this article, right? This set of evidences, and he ignores me. He says, I can't do that. I can't go there. So what he's basically doing is he's taking off of the table an enormous set of empirical data and therefore constructs his story without that data, right? Do you get that? If you construct your story without that data, it doesn't work. So the best story covers the most data, right? From the most realms, right? From the most wisdom streams, from the most forms of exterior science and the most forms of interior science. Okay, so there is the best story we can tell. Having said that, I know we're going crazy deep here, but that's not that you can only construct one story. You can construct multiple plausible stories. Just some of the plausible stories don't take as much information as they should into account. But there's still more than one plausible story that you can construct. Now, here's the fancy footwork, meaning there's an ontological pluralism of stories. Right? In other words, there's more than one plausible story you can construct, even if it's fair to say that there is a better story. They're not all equal. Okay, does that make sense, everyone? There's an ontological pluralism of stories. But that means that the most powerful thing that you can do is choose to tell the most accurate story. And it's because story is the source code of cosmos. So by choosing to construct a story and to tell the most accurate story and to bring the most human beings possible into a shared global story of value, that is the single most potent and cogent and powerful act we can do today, is to tell a new story. And it's only that new story of what it means to be a human being, of who we are, our identity, right? Who we are, right? Where we are, what kind of world do we live in? Is it a cold, materialist, indifferent cosmos, or is it a cosmos in which there's a welcome sign, right? And what's there to do? What's our response to the world? Do we have a response ability? Right? You know, the what question, it's only those questions handled in a story of value that actually will bottom up, self-organizing universe, self-actualizing cosmos, right? The interior rules of cosmos iterated exponentially, simple first rules, simple answers to these questions: who, where, what. It's only that which actually changed the fabric of reality and actually birth a new human and a new humanity. Does that make sense? Okay, that's what we're doing here. What we're doing here is we're telling this new story. That's what we're committed to. So we don't go straight to, oh, let's say something inspiring. No. The inspiration is actually inspiration inspired when we're breathed anew, right? Hallelujah, right? Leonard Cohen writes, hallelujah. He borrows it from the book of Psalms, right? Hallelujah, right? The pristine praise and the drunken intoxication of life is Yah, is the breath of the divine. Yah. And Yah means inspired, right? I'm breathed. What breathes me anew? What gives me new breath? What allows me to catch my breath? What makes me breathless with ecstasy, right? A genuine new story of value in which I can actually locate myself, in which actually organizes elegantly and beautifully, artistically, the most information we have, interiors and exteriors, the most feeling we have, the most pathos we have, the most longing we have, the most yearning, right? And its information is not just quantitative, commodifiable. Information is the information about my longings and about my yearnings and about my deepest knowings, right? And about that which is non-commodifiable and that which is immeasurable. All of that needs to be taken into account and articulated, met deeply in a new story of value. And that story of value, we've got to be able to tell to 7-year-olds all over the world and to 90-year-olds, right? To every color and every country and every region, right? And every form of belief or disbelief. It's got to be a shared story of value. That is actually doable. That is what will change the course of history, without question. And history is his story or her story. History is about story. It's about the realization that there's a plot line. So we get to participate, right, in changing the vector of history by actually recognizing the contours of the story, getting beneath the headlines and saying, what's actually happening here? What's actually driving this? Telling that story. And the realization that emerges from all of this is that it's a love story. The actual reality is animated by Eros. And Eros is the movement of reality in its radical aliveness towards ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness. It's the movement of separate parts to form larger wholes, right? It's the movement of new forms of relationship. That's what all of reality is. Okay, so this is why Barbara Marx Hubbard, right? You know, my dear beloved friend, right, who was a partner in founding One Mountain, Many Paths. We founded it together in a late night conversation, and we've been going for 30 weeks, 35 weeks, 40 weeks, somewhere around there, right? And our commitment, Barbara spent her life, completely committed her life to telling the new story. Okay, so that's what we want to do today. We want to tell today literally a new chapter in the news story. And I want to tell it in a new way because I've spent the last 3 or 4 days deep in a particular plot line of the story. And I want to share with you some of what's emerged. And I want to tell it to honor Barbara. And I just have to say, you know, it brings tears to my eyes. You know, I miss Barbara immensely. She was evolutionary Wholemate, you know, dear and beloved. And she was filled with a kind of radical positivity and a radical wonder and a radical delight. And she understood the political, economic, social, existential, moral, spiritual impact of telling this new story of value. And we spend, you know, all of our time together crafting, right, the plot lines of this story. And there was one particular part of the story that I was actually privileged to share with Barbara that she got very, very excited about and talked about a lot. And so I want to, we're dedicating this week to Barbara. Barbara passed away, right? Oh my God, right? A few years ago. Can't believe it's 2023. Right? Barbara passes away. Can it be 5 years ago, my friends? Right, on April 10th. On April 10th, right? I was there by the bedside, right? And I miss you enormously, Barbara. And you knew of the continuity of consciousness. I'm a bit mad at you that you haven't come to visit me, right? I'd like you to come visit and talk and be with us, but I know that you're here, and I know that we're holding hands in this in the deepest way and holding hearts, and we're doing this together. And so today we want to dedicate this one mountain to Barbara Marx Hubbard, and we want to do that by telling a new chapter in a new way, a chapter that we've alluded to before. We began working on a few years ago. We're actually going to be putting out 2 volumes about this new story that are actually getting prepared for the publisher literally right now. It's what I've been working on all week. But the whole story recontextualized itself for me this week. And I want to tell you this story this week and maybe next week, just in a new way. And it's about the future of relationships. It's the most personal, intimate story. And it's also the most broad cosmic story. And it's a key dimension of our response to the meta crisis, our response to the second shock of existence. Okay, so let me just check in for a second. I'm feeling a little bit self-conscious. Was that too much for everyone? How many people were able to track that and to follow that? How many people tracked that? How'd you all do? That was a lot, right? How'd everybody do? Everyone tracking? We inside? Okay, we good? Okay, we're going to deepen this, okay? So I'm going to turn to our beloved resonator of codes, right, to step in and resonate the code for us. We have a particular evolutionary love code this week, right? Lady JL, right? Delighted, delighted, delighted. Let's step in. Let's resonate this code. Let's go like crazy deep in. Let's blow the house open. Let's love it open and actually articulate and find at least the first dimension of this new piece of the story. Lady Jacqueline, take us away from Merry, Merry England. Here we go. Cha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mark. It's my privilege and pleasure and delight to resonate the code this week. We're confronted by crisis, cellular crisis, personal crisis, and meta crisis. Every crisis is a crisis of intimacy. The meta crisis, for example, is a global intimacy disorder. A crisis of intimacy can only be solved by the emergence of a new level of intimacy. The root of the meta-crisis is in the alienated relationship of the part from the whole. The part is non-intimate with the whole. A crisis of intimacy is a crisis of relationship. The crisis is resolved by a whole new level of relationship. We call homo-amor relationships wholemate relationships or evolutionary relationships. Wholemate relationships are an essential dimension of the new story of value in response to the meta-crisis. Wholemate relationships are also, not coincidentally, a crucial dimension in response to the personal crisis of love experienced by every human being, whether they are in a role-mate or soulmate relationship, or they refuse to enter such a relationship because it does not address their deepest longing. Thank you.
So let's keep that code up, okay? Let's see if we can find this, everyone, okay? Here we go. This is a big one. This is a big one, right? So let's see if we can find this, right? Is everyone ready to go? Are we ready to play a larger game? We're ready to play? We're in this revolutionary act. We want to tell the new story. So are we ready to play a larger game? Are we ready to participate directly and literally in the evolution of love and telling this new story? So let's see if we can grab this. And it's shocking, it's simple, it's elegant, and it's complex, and it's second simplicity, and it's beautiful. Okay? So let's see if we can get this. Okay, here we go. Here we go. So there's a meta crisis. We talked in the beginning of this one mountain and in many other conversations about the nature of the metacrisis. At its core, we've said that there are two generator functions and an underlying root cause. Generator function, we're telling a bad story, okay? We're telling a bad story. What's the bad story we're telling? We're telling a story which is a success story, which every individual is an atomized, separate self-individual, engaged in one level or another in their company, in their family, in their life, in their nation, between nations, between divisions of companies, between, right, always engaged in a rivalrous conflict, governed by win-lose metrics. And generally, different versions of zero-sum win-lose metrics. That's one. That generates a fragile world, a world that is optimized for efficiency and not resiliency, with vulnerable supply chains, vulnerable resources, right? Vulnerable, ill-cared for human beings, vulnerable social structures with massive gaps between haves and have-nots, right? A world in which the very foundational ecosystems are at risk in the very next relatively short period of time, all because everyone's involved not in a relationship to the whole, but in an atomized relationship to the particular rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics in which they're involved. That generates, right, a fragile system subject to breakdown at the most fundamental of levels. Now, underlying those two generator functions, fragile systems and win-lose metrics, which govern rivalrous conflict, there's something deeper, which we called, both earlier today and in many other conversations, we called it a global intimacy disorder. And there's kind of a standard, very beautiful, that it was a very beautiful piece that was put together by Elena from a bunch of our conversations, kind of a standard piece, which can kind of go into the chat box a little later, which is kind of the basic statement, this basic statement of this understanding. You know, underneath these two generator functions, there's a global intimacy disorder. Global intimacy disorder means, right, a failure of the part to relate to the whole. So the failure is the inability to feel the whole, right? To be omniconsiderate for the sake of the whole, to be madly in love with the whole, to participate not just locally, but globally and ultimately galactically, and to realize that everything affects everything else, that I have no identity without the whole, without the plankton under the ocean, without certain kinds of topsoil, without all these different dimensions of the biosphere, without certain kinds of bugs or caterpillars, right? Or fish. I don't exist. I don't exist. There is no me outside of the broadest frame of we. So there's a global intimacy disorder, a failure of relationship to the whole. What do we need to do? We need to tell a new story of value, which reweaves our identity and locates us in the whole, and actually locates our nature as homo amor, as human beings who are not merely separate self, but we're actually true self, meaning we're part of the whole, and we're actually unique self, we're unique expressions of the whole. We're evolutionary unique self, we evolve the whole. That's a new form of relationship. It's a new form of relationship to self. It's a new form of relationship to reality. And from that place of homo amor, it's a new form of relationship to each other. Okay, now stay close. That's the background. That's just the context. Okay, now let's see, we can kind of sharpen it. So what are we saying? We're saying that only a new story of value can actually respond to the metacrisis. Now, the core of reality, and that's part two. That was the context, okay? That was the context. Now let's go deep in. Ready? Are we ready to go deep in? Now let's go much, much deeper in. Let's drop in a level. Let's drop in a level. So the core of reality is evolution, okay? Stay close. Reality is evolution. That's what reality is. Reality is evolution. Evolution is a series of transformations. 1, 2, ready, Naomi? Here we go. Ready, Naeem? Here we go. 2, reality is relationships. It's the core of reality. All of reality is relationships. all the way down the evolutionary chain, all the way up the evolutionary chain. That's 2. 3, reality is the evolution of relationships. Okay, so reality is evolution, reality is relationship, reality is the evolution of relationships. This is structural to reality. It starts to get exciting. Now, 4, what drives evolution? How do relationships evolve, right? So they evolve in 2 ways. 1, relationships evolve because there's an inherent drive in cosmos to seek ever more eros, and which means ever deeper forms of relationship. That fair, there's an inherent drive in cosmos. That's one inherent drive for greater eros in cosmos, which seeks greater relationship. But 2, right, the second driver, right, of the evolution of relationships is crisis. Crisis. Everyone tracking? Crisis is an evolutionary driver. Okay? Now, got that? That's crisis. Now, that's number, what are we up to? That's number 4. Now 5. Now 5, okay? Every crisis is a crisis of relationship. Does everyone get that? All crisis is a crisis of relationship, which is another way of saying all crisis is a crisis of intimacy. Because intimacy is the relationship, when a relationship is formed in which we realize we actually have shared identity. We can actually feel each other and recognize each other. We have a shared field of value. We have shared purpose. That's called intimacy. So intimacy is a form of relationship. So every crisis is a crisis of relationship. Every crisis is a crisis of intimacy. That's 5. 6, you can't solve a problem at the level of consciousness which created the problem. Albert Einstein's famous, pithy, and correct observation, right? Made by many people before him, but a correct observation, right? You can't solve a problem at the level of consciousness that created the problem. That's 6. 7, so every crisis in relationship or every crisis in intimacy is solved by a new level of relationship, by a new level of intimacy. Does that make sense? That's actually structural to cosmos. Does everyone get that? That's 7, right? So every crisis in relationship is solved by a new level of relationship, by a new level of intimacy, by a new structure of intimacy, right? That's 7. 8, now it gets very beautiful. That's true about every form of crisis. Okay, we're now in the code. We're in this week's evolutionary love code, if anyone's noticed. But don't put the code in the chat box. Let's keep following in the chat box our numbers. So number 8, every form of crisis, without exception, right, is solved by a new level of relationship, right, and a new level of intimacy, because every crisis is a crisis of intimacy and a crisis of relationship. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, good. So number 9, let's take a look at it. Let's look at 3 forms of crisis. Just do it in 2 seconds, right? The biological crisis, what's called often the oxygen crisis, and Zohar and I just wrote a footnote on this, right? The oxygen crisis at the dawn, right, of reality, in which single-celled organisms were being destroyed by oxygen, right, because of their cellular makeup. We won't go into the details of it now. We were literally killing out cellular life on the planet. And so what happened was this crisis of intimacy, right, this crisis of relationship actually generated a new form of life, multicellular life, prokaryotes to eukaryotes, and multicellular life leads directly into animals, mammals, and the human being. So crisis, a biological crisis, what's often called the oxidization crisis, the oxygen crisis, generates the crisis of intimacy, right, between, right, oxygen, the elements, the biosphere, the single-celled organisms, right, generates, right, a new structure of intimacy, multicellular organisms, which are able to actually be nourished by oxygen, right? Okay, that's a biological crisis. Personal crisis, right? Personal crisis is always a crisis of relationship, and it can only be solved by a new level of relationship, either a new level of relationship to self, right? I've split myself off from my second innocence. I've split myself off from my capacity to take a seat at the table, right? So I can only solve that by re-embracing and reintegrating the parts of myself that I've split off. Otherwise, I can't do it, right? In other words, whether it's a relationship to self or a relationship to other, it's only a new level of relationship that allows me to solve personal crisis. Okay, that's 8, or that's 9. Okay, 10. I'm going to zone in here for a second, okay? I'm going to zone in here for a second. There's a huge crisis today in love. And relationship is not working. I want to kind of say that kind of clearly. Relationship's not working. This is not working, right? Marriage, right? Most of the world is not ultimately working. Either people are not getting married because they can't find a partner who meets their deepest longing, or people are getting married and they feel deadened and trapped, right, in the relationship. The marriage structure, or the love structure in the world isn't actually quite working. Our structure of relationship doesn't work. Now, if we notice, let's just notice what happened in a relationship in the last, let's say, several hundred years. Let's focus, let's say, in the last, 40, 50. So 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, the basic structure of relationship at its core, the center of gravity was roommate. We share roles, right? Our context for relating was shared roles, right? Homemaker, mother, nurturer, bearer of children. That was the role of the woman, the feminine, the masculine, protector, right? Provider, right? Breadwinner, right? That was the basic structure, and everyone was in their particular role. That was the context for relating. There was a profound need that lived between people, and there was a mutual, utter, radical dependency. We were utterly dependent on each other for survival and for thrival. The context for relating was surviving and thriving, and each person played their own role. End of story. Now, occasionally there were deeper trends in relationship. There were deeper forms of relationship. There were, ideals of courtly love in the Cathar world, and in the medieval world, there were ideals of love in different sections of biblical literature, right? But the center of gravity of actual relationship was always roommate in one form or another for the preponderance of history world over. What happened is, in the last 40, 50 years, that became insufficient, right? And there was this enormous desire for depth. A new depth, a sharing of our vulnerability, for genuine communication, for a sharing of our mutual senses of trauma and wounding, right? For an ability to have empathos of a whole different kind, to feel each other in a whole different way. And that was the introduction of this notion of soulmate. And soulmate became kind of the preeminent, at least, desire for relationship, right, in most of the world. The problem is, and it's a deep and a profound problem, is that soulmates didn't quite know what to do with each other. They loved the personal fulfillment of looking deeply in each other's eyes. And looking deeply in each other's eyes is the great soulmate activity. And sharing wounding and sharing brokenness and sharing personal history. And actually the three famous soulmate books, right? One, written by Harville Hendricks, my dear friend, called Getting the Love You Want, and a manual for communication in the subtitle. John Gray, another dear friend, who wrote Venus and Mars, and also the subtitle, kind of a manual for communication. And of course, Gary Chapman, who I don't know, who wrote the 5 love languages, of course, language, also about a manual for communication. These are all the new soulmate books, right? And they all were very, very important. It was a great momentous leap forward, a great evolutionary leap forward. There was actually an evolution of relationship. There was a crisis in relationship at the level of roommate. And then there's this crisis is met by this new form of relationship called soulmate. But soulmate's not holding. Soulmate's not holding because at a certain point, there's something fragile and devastating in a soulmate relationship, which is there's not an actual genuine sense of shared urgent purpose. We're looking deeply in each other's eyes. And in some sense, the personal fulfillment of looking deeply in each other's eyes is no longer personally fulfilling. It feels too alienated from the larger context, right? We don't actually have a sense of a shared world. We don't have a sense of a shared field of value. We don't have a sense of genuine mutuality of recognition, right? We've let go of the roommate. We don't need each other in the old roommate way to survive. We could each actually theoretically survive independently. So we're coming together because we choose to come together, right? At the level of roommate, we say to each other, I need you, and I need you desperately to survive. At the level of soulmate, right? Women are working, Lots of men are actually not working, right? The balance has changed, right? Lots of men are actually not providers and protectors. Some are. Lots of women are providers and protectors, right? The old deal in relationship is no longer in play, right? So when I say I need a woman or I need a man at the level of soulmate, it means something very different than it does at the level of roommate. It doesn't mean I need you for survival. It means I choose you. I don't need you in the old survival way, at least an enormous amount of the world does, an enormous amount of the world still does. But there's still a huge leading edge swath, right, all over the world where I'm not getting together because we're at a roommate level of I need you. No, it's actually I choose you. I choose you because I don't want to be alone. I choose you because I want us to mutually resonate and to feel each other. I want us to share stories and share history and share brokenness and share the stories of our trauma and hold our wounds together and love each other and look deeply in each other's eyes. And then at some point, that doesn't quite cut it. At some point, that's not quite enough. It's a momentous leap forward, but it's not enough, right? There's insufficient ground. And there begins to become this emergence of this lining of tragic in relationship. And this is what I meant when I said it's not working. Relationships aren't working. The soulmate contract, and this is heresy. You're not allowed to say this. This is heresy, but it's true. The soulmate contract isn't working. It doesn't actually hold. Soulmate without a roommate dimension doesn't hold. But we don't want to go back to roommate. We don't want to go back to the old world, right? Christine Amelon, you don't want to go back to the old world where you can't run your company and have power and an integrity and autonomy. You don't want to go back, right? We don't want to go back, right? So we want to evolve. Now watch, it gets really wild and beautiful, okay? So we're at a crisis in relationship in which, although no one will say it out loud, the emperor has no clothes, soulmate relationship is not working. It's not working. It's insufficient ground to hold relationship. So you've got this new crisis in relationship. Now that crisis of relationship is happening at the exact same time as the meta crisis. Does everyone catch that? So there's a global meta crisis, what we called in the beginning the second shock of existence, the realization that we face the potential death of humanity or the death of our humanity, two different forms of the meta crisis. Right? The second shock of existence, catastrophic risk, existential risk, that's a meta crisis. It's a global meta crisis. That's one crisis. A second crisis is there's this personal crisis in our relationships. We're actually not satisfied by the soulmate relationship. There's something tragic about that relationship. It actually doesn't feel like it has ground. And as many love songs as we write, and as many Harlequin romances, right? It just doesn't quite hold. There's something fundamentally missing in the very foundation of relationship. Now, whenever there's a crisis, it's always a crisis of intimacy. Whenever there's a crisis, it's always a crisis of relationship. So the crisis in love is a crisis in intimacy. It's a crisis of relationship. Roommate relationships, we don't want to regress to the old breadwinner, homemaker, forced role where you don't have any other options. That's the forced role. That's the enforced role. That's the coerced role. You're kind of stuck in that role. That's just the way it is. We don't have clarity that that's the way it should be. 200 years ago, there was like, oh, we were clear. That's the way it should be. Today, it's completely ambiguous. It's not the way it should be. There's lots of other options, right? Men want a wider vision of being a man and women want a wider vision of being a woman. And these prescribed roles simply don't hold anymore as a necessary form of relationship. We evolved to soulmate. We think, okay, soulmate's the answer, but it doesn't quite hold us. It's not quite enough. We don't want to just sit and look in one person's eyes and exile everyone else. And so there's a need for a new form of relationship, for a new form of intimacy. Now, we call that new form of intimacy, friends, you with me, friends? We call that new form of intimacy wholemate. Wow. Wholemate. Wholemate relationships, or evolutionary relationships, or homo-amor relationships. And the essence of a wholemate relationship, and there's lots of dimensions to it. I'm going to talk about it more next week. But the essence of a wholemate relationship is that there's a new context for relating. Right? There's a new set of values at play. The wholemate relationships, in the wholemate relationship, the two parties to the relationship are not just looking in each other's eyes, they're looking at a wider horizon together. And it's unimaginably lonely not to be able to look at a wider horizon, at a shared horizon with your partner. It's not enough to look in your partner's eyes. At a certain point, that doesn't hold. You have to be looking together at a shared field of value, at a shared horizon. And when you look together at a shared horizon, then you can turn and look back to each other. Then love explodes again in an entirely different and deeper form. So this new form of relationship, wholemate, meaning both partners in the relationship are in service to the larger whole. Wow. And this next piece I'm going to talk about much more next week, but both parties to the relationship come with their own prior wholeness. And as in a roommate relationship, neither side is whole. They don't even exist. They can't survive without each other. So neither side has wholeness by themselves. Neither of the beloveds, the masculine or the feminine, however that expresses itself. In a soulmate relationship, the same is true. I feel incomplete without you. Without you witnessing me, I don't exist, right? I'm masculine, but I need your feminine, right, in order to be whole. And I'm feminine, I need your masculine in order to be whole. So we both come broken, incomplete, and you're going to complete me. I don't have wholeness without you. To a wholemate relationship, we come with a certain sense of wholeness already in place. I'm going to talk about that in depth next week, what that means. And it means 3 different things. But just for now, it means I actually come whole to the relationship. And then in the relationship, I evolve and deepen my wholeness with you, right? But it's more paradoxical. I don't come because I don't exist without you. I exist without you, but I'm powerful without you. I've established some interior sense of wholeness myself, and then I bring that wholeness to the relationship. So I'm a wholemate in 2 ways. One is I have a sense of integrity, autonomy, and wholeness within myself that I bring to the relationship. So it's not a survive, thrive, codependency, number 1. Number 2, I have a kind of emotional wholeness that I can kind of hold within myself that I bring to the relationship. And number 3, we're both in service to the larger whole. So this is an evolution of relationships we've just described from roommate to soulmate to wholemate. Now, here, watch carefully. It's very beautiful. But this evolution of relationships is not this new, strange social construct that happens to emerge at this moment in history. Actually, reality is relationship. Reality is evolution. Reality is the evolution of relationship. Relationship evolves through the inherent drive for new forms of relationship, and relationship evolves through crisis. Crisis births a new form of relationship. That's true all the way down and all the way up the evolutionary chain, right? So at this moment in history, when we're facing a crisis of love, right, a crisis of relationship, a new form of relationship has to emerge. We have to go from soulmate to wholemate. Now, stay close. Wholemate includes soulmate, but it transcends soulmate. Right? It includes and transcends soulmate. It has all the best dimensions of soulmate, but then it transcends. We're actually sharing a vision together. We can see together. We're looking at a shared horizon. Now, here, the entire point of today was to get to this last piece. Then we're going to turn to Barbara. We're going to turn to Barbara in 1 minute. But everything we did today was to get to this last piece, which is the meta crisis is also an intimacy disorder, right? Just like the personal crisis in relationship is a crisis of intimacy. So the meta crisis is also an intimacy disorder. That's what we described. It's an intimacy disorder in which our stories win-lose metrics, a success story. We produce a fragile system in which parts don't actually recognize or know each other. We create financial instruments in China that wreck American markets, but people don't even know each other. We're not thinking, we're not omniconsiderate for the larger whole. So at this moment, which the basic structure of reality is relationship, but relationships are all win-lose metrics, that then iterates exponentially into a fragile system that breaks down, that generates an extraction model, that extracts resources, that depletes reality, that creates violent caste systems, right? That actually generates all the structures that will actually undermine our very existence on the planet. So what do we need? We need that our basic structure of reality relationship evolve. How do we evolve it? We evolve the basic structure of relationship from a win-lose metrics, and even a couple together, a couple between themselves are in a win-lose metrics. And then as a couple, they're in a win-lose metrics against everyone else. But no, now we want to evolve the basic structure of relationship from soulmate to wholemate. And wholemate means we're whole as a couple, but we're actually whole individually. We're also in a relationship in service to the larger whole. So we have a shared horizon, and part of our shared horizon is the meta crisis. And part of our shared horizon is a shared vision of value. And imagine if all couples in the world become wholemates. So instead of them being a family, which is a nuclear family involved in success stories and win-lose metrics with everyone else, right? Every couple, every relationship, whether it's a romantic couple or a friendship couple, right? Whatever the kind of couple is, it's a wholemate couple in which it's not just us looking in each other's eyes, but we're actually looking at a shared horizon and we're acting together. We're not just joining genes, we're joining genius to co-create a new reality. And the basic structure of reality relationship then evolves. So the meta crisis, which is an alienation from the larger whole, begins to be resolved by the introduction of a new form of relationship, which is wholemate, which is relationship to the larger whole, right? And so if the meta crisis is a failed story, a story of alienation from the larger whole, then it's a new story, a story of being omni-considered to the larger whole that resolves the meta crisis. And an essential part of that new story, which we call homo amor. Homo sapien becomes homo amor, the new human and the new humanity. An essential part of that new story is a new story of relationship. What's that new story of relationship? The movement from roommate to soulmate to wholemate, to evolutionary relationships, to homo amor relationships. You begin to see how beautiful it is? So both the personal crisis as a crisis of intimacy is resolved by a new structure of intimacy. And the meta crisis is a global intimacy disorder. The meta crisis is a global intimacy disorder, which is also resolved by a new global intimacy, right? A new story of shared value and a new structure of relationship, which is the core structure that creates intimacy. And the new structure of relationship becomes no longer soulmates, separate self wholemates, separate self soulmates, sharing each other's wounding as the basic structure of their relationship. No, wholemates who love each other passionately, who do share wounding and do share personal story, but they also are connected to the larger story, right? To the larger whole. They're in service to the larger whole. Wow. Wow. Like, wow. Like, wow. And that's what one of the things that Barbara and I were wildly excited about. And I know we're taking a little extra time today. I know it's 2:06, but I want to turn now to Barbara. Okay, and we're going to take like 6 minutes to really wildly honor Barbara and to hear Barbara speak this, right? And this was just literally in the last years as Barbara and I were wholemating together. And of course, friends, you can have more than one wholemate, right? Wholemate's a kind of sacred polyamorous, right? You can be wholemates with a number of people, right? Because you're actually loving each other madly. You're in service to the larger whole. And imagine that the fabric of reality is evolutionary wholemates. What a different world we would live in. Let's take a look. Let's hear from Barbara. Right, here we go. Oh my God. Right, what a crazy, crazy delight. So do we have Barbara ready, my friends? We love Barbara. Here we go.
Thank you, Mark. That is exactly right. In terms of, I must have been born for wholemating, because from my earliest days, I can remember I am inspired by the inner impulse of creativity or evolution. And once I learned that there was evolution, and once I realized I am evolution evolving, I started to look for mates that wanted to co-evolve with me. And I made a lot of efforts. And I had quite a few relationships. All of them had a flavor of wholemating. And I won't go into all of them until I met you. So I'm going to make this personal. I was about 84 or 85. I had done quite a few things with others and with men as well to discuss the evolutionary potential. But when I met you, and this is why I think wholemating is so profound in terms of love, in terms of purpose, your particular impulse of evolution, the inspiration that's guiding your entire being toward the unique self, the evolutionary unique self, the cosmos, and the whole thing. When I heard you, somebody said, would you interview Marc Gafni? And I said, sure. I didn't know who you were. As we started to talk, what happened? Now, this is wholemating. You were telling me your impulse of evolution, you were speaking about it, and I began to feel the evolutionary impulse inside me, which had sort of gotten, well, maybe I've done everything I could possibly do. I'm 84 or 85. What happened, now this is on the inner plane about wholemating. The evolutionary impulse, which was the purpose of my deepest life, got turned on. And it more or less became really interested in what you were directing your life toward. So the thing about wholemating that we discovered very personally, and then we're seeing it exist for so many others, we discovered that wholemating is joining genius. Rather than joining genes to have the baby, which was the role mate, basically creating the families, and the soul mate, which is your soul and your deep emotional realities wanting to join, and sexually as well. But wholemating is you're passionately excited about purpose, about possibility, and particularly at the 11th hour, when we can see that the crisis could lead to the devolution of our whole species, rather than the deep desire for reproducing more of us, the desire is to evolve us. So I'd like to say that in the real deep wholemate relationship, the passion for joining genius is not just a response to the crisis, even consciously, but it's a solution to the crisis. Because when people join genius, whether it's partners like you and me, or many different kinds of groups, when you join genius, what happens is that the unique purpose of each of the partners evolves. So you're not joining a static genius code and that you get two genius codes and you learn something from each other. It's deeper than that. When you join genius with another's genius, it turns your genius on, and in a wholemate relationship, both are more than they were when they met. And then as the evolution of wholemating continues, you begin to actually create things together. And what I would like to say about joining genius is that nature has created a new capacity here. People have had genius all throughout history, but the idea of wholemating to literally join them, it's like joining genes to have a baby. The baby is new. The baby is more than just the two parents' genes. That genetic code is new. Joining genius is more than the additive joining of two wholemates' uniqueness. It's evolutionary, if we may say so. And it puts you at a threshold of more of your genius and more of this other person's genius until those two geniuses start to become something new for humanity. And just like having babies was something new for humanity, wholemating, joining genius, is something new for humanity. And in the 11th hour, when there is such a crisis of relationship everywhere, those of us who move into wholemates and describe it and share it and actually replicate with others that joining genius will be responding in a new way to the 11th hour. And I would say I'm inviting anybody who is hearing this to try it out and see where your genius is stimulated by somebody else's. And then it's deep conversations, it's deep exploring, it's deep respect. It's not trying to be better than, it's not trying to get even with or show off with. It's actually mutuality at a very profound level of social and personal response to love. It's the evolution of love, actually. So I say that we'll complete chapter 10 of the 11th hour on the theme of the evolution of love through becoming wholemates. And thank you, Marc. Marc has a beautiful analogy for this, and I quote him respectfully. He starts out to say the first relationship that most of us have was role mate.
Okay, yeah.
I had that. I got married, have as many children as possible, take care of your husband and house. I was not a rebel at all. I just did it.
Right.
And so did most women, and so did most of them get depressed. But they all did it, the educated women of that generation. So, okay, that was Wholemate.
Okay.
Then we started to move in the 60s, 70s, 80s into Soulmate.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, we care for each other, we support each other, particularly if we're wounded, we heal each other, very, very loving, caring, however, also not totally passionate.
Yeah.
Third one, just rolling around, he calls Wholemate, with Wholemate for shared purpose.
Mm. And that's obviously not necessarily just between two people. Wholemate could be more of a community, yeah?
Well, this is all remains to be seen.
Okay.
But first of all, if you take the two people, each one has to be whole.
Yeah. Which is a feat.
So you don't get to be Wholemate with Wholemate unless you get to be whole.
Right, right. So
Now,
you have to start with yourself.
So
really.
what I found to get to be whole, I had to consolidate all aspects of my being.
Okay.
My local self, my essential self,
Yeah.
what I'm calling my universal higher frequency self,
Yeah.
my love of Jesus, my Christ love, Christos. And if I bring and integrate all of those selves,
Yeah.
what happens to me is I begin to substantiate.
Okay.
I become substantial in wholeness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, one little part will go off this way or go
Right.
off. Let's say I get feeling of failure.
Yeah.
Okay, off goes local self.
Right.
So I know enough to rope it back in
Right.
and not to just run after it and get lost.
Sure.
So that's where the director of attention comes in.
Right. And the key is that all of your selves are always
Right.
there and available in every aspect of what you're
And
doing.
so you get alert.
Yeah.
And then here's the next one. You have to self-calibrate all the time
Okay.
as to what is yours to do.
Okay.
Say, I'm sure all of us have this, but I certainly do. There are many, many things I could do.
Sure. And sometimes even want to do, right? Yeah.
All of them,
Yeah.
let's say. I love all of them. How do I choose
Yeah.
to self-calibrate? Well, I have to go back to that deep impulse, and I have to see it as an impulse of creation given to me, you might say, by the divine process of evolution. It's not just a personal whim.
Yeah.
And the way you know it is the compass of joy. Not just by figuring out which would be better or more profitable.
Sure. What really brings joy.
It brings joy, it brings love, it brings heart, it brings creativity. So you get attuned to what does that for you.
Mm.
It's not so easy.
Yeah, no.
And then you have to attune to who else or how many others are you to do this with. Just take it one other for the moment.
Sure.
So that means this other person has to go through the same thing. They have to become whole.
Yeah.
All their different parts. And the need to dominate, the need to control, the feeling of inadequacies, the feeling of, compulsiveness, the feeling of being, somehow addicted to something,
Mm-hmm.
anything.
Yeah.
If you want to be a Wholemate, it also means you want to go the whole way in this lifetime.
Yeah.
That's a double entendre.
Yeah.
Everything you could possibly be. So I go back to my father, do your best.
Right.
Jump over. To do my best, I have to become whole.
Yeah.
And in order to fulfill that wholeness, I need to have a Wholemate or more.
Mm.
And that's what I have.
Gotcha. Yeah. That's amazing.
So
yeah.
Wholemate with Wholemate
Right.
is the next stage of relationship, we're saying.
Right.
And evolution is relationship. So when you get whole and are able to have Wholemate relationships of whatever kind and how many, I don't know, because this is new to me.
Right.
But it's also wonderful for the postmenopausal woman who would be supposedly declining
Right.
to find out that she's arising.
And that, I mean, you're doing that, and
I am.
I feel you, just so much vitality.
I'm
It's like
arising.
you're getting young. Yeah, you're getting younger.
I'm getting newer.
Newer.
See, it's really not younger.
Okay,
Because I
newer.
wouldn't want to be younger.
Right, right.
And
yeah.
neither would anybody that I know.
Right.
Because you go through a lot to get to right where you are. And the idea,
I don't want to do that over again.
No, thank you.
Right. So newer. Oh.
Newer every day. And then Wholemate with Wholemate creates babies, and the babies are the works and the gifts for humanity.
Barbara lives, right? I believe, and not only believe, I know the continuity of consciousness. And I'm going to turn to Krista to close us, and stay with us, friends. These last few minutes are everything. So we can actually pray together. We can vision together. We can Wholemate together. We are a community committed to the larger whole. We're committed to the evolution of love. We're committed to Wholemating together. We're committed to the shattering of loneliness as we actually participate in the sensual depth of participating together in the communion, the intimate communion of the evolution of consciousness. Right, Barbara Marx Hubbard, we miss you madly. Right? We pour energy right into you and in the next stage, and know that you're here and that you're impacting and influencing, and may the merit and the goodness of your influence and of your pouring into us pour into you. Oh my God, I turn the word to Krista. Barbara Marx Hubbard, thank you.